Soilborne plant diseases. All right, everybody, welcome back to Archie's Acres and the VSAP program. We're going to talk about soil-borne plant diseases in this lecture and how to try our best to sustainably manage disease issues. Why does disease happen? Disease attacks a host. In this case, our crop is the host, but what it needs to survive is a favorable environment. All right, so one of the keys to sustainable management of disease issues is to ensure that there isn't a favorable environment for that disease-causing pathogen. We want to ensure that we're not conducting practices after the fact. We want to establish this practices and management issues to try to ensure that we don't have a disease infection to deal with to begin with. And so we want to make an environment that's less disease friendly, that will help our plant be less susceptible to diseases. So general principle, especially on the organic side, is to ensure there's high levels of microorganisms, high levels of diversity and quantity of microorganisms in the soils, and they have the food source they need to survive and be well. Again, if they don't have if microorganisms, any organisms, to include you and I, don't have a food source, we'll starve off and die. In most cases, for microorganisms, organic matter is all the food source they need. So it's just about being sure that organic matter is present either in the soils or in the systems that we're referring to. Again, the higher the diversity, the more stable the ecosystem. And the reason why is because when we have, again, large diversity and large quantity of microorganisms, they compete for each other for food sources, antagonize each other, and there are pathogenic fungi and bacteria and nematodes that can attack disease-causing pathogens, which is what we prefer. So through the competition and antagonism primarily, though, it makes it difficult for disease-causing pathogens to have much effect because it's competing just to stay alive as opposed to thriving on your crop. And you kind of see the graph on the right-hand side of the street, on the side of your screen. We can have inoculants like our compost teas, which is a supply of our microorganisms, organic matter and minerals, which is a food source for the microorganisms, and then good irrigation practices. One of the common cause for disease on our crops is poor irrigation practices like overwatering. When we overwater, too much moisture in the root zone, not enough oxygen, it causes diseases like damping off and root rot problems. A lot of times it's also an issue of the type of soil we're growing in, like clays, for instance. Clay, on top of the fact that we're applying too much water, makes a great environment, which is one that lacks oxygen in the root zone, which is one that a disease can thrive in. So various controls for disease-causing pathogens. We can use other pathogens to help control diseases, and we can do so on a very specific level. One example is, and what we mean by that is a specific organism to attack a specific type of diseases, or in some case, a broad range of diseases. But trichoderma is one of these diseases. You could buy the spore, trichoderma, which is a beneficial fungus. You can buy these commercially available, fairly expensive, but it is available. And you see on the graph to the right, it actually will wrap itself around disease-causing strands and essentially strangle it off, almost like a constricting snake would. And it can help us reduce or eliminate root rots and other disease-causing problems. Can be very effective and efficient, but again, they do cost money. Sometimes they are expensive, and oftentimes they need to be reapplied, which means they're dumping more money into it. But they do tend to work very well. But if we're using these type of inputs, we typically want to stay away from using them as a reactive mode, meaning I have a problem and now let me treatment. Definitely for these type of controls, we want to stay on the proactive side, making it part of a larger integrated pest management practices. And then we have high biodiversity mode of control by using large numbers and a diversity of the type of microorganisms. Again, we just talked about this to help control, which will suppress through competition and antagonism. Suppressive soils, again, are those soils that have large numbers of organisms. Good fertility levels, not to an over or toxicity of nutrients, and not a lack of nutrients. If we lack nutrients, the plants can be unhealthy, won't be able to naturally defend itself, just like we as people, when we have poor diet and lack of good nutrition, we'll be more susceptible to becoming sick and so forth. Our plants are the same way. And going back to the moisture issue, ensuring we have good drainage in our soil and the structure of our soil overall is good to go. And sometimes that refers to the texture. Clay soils can be difficult in terms of diseases because of the ability to hold on to a lot of water and little airspace. Other mechanical forms of producing suppressive soil: induced resistant, direct parasitism, and nutrient competition. Again, these are mechanisms within suppressive soils that take place. There are 4 factors that we want to strive for within our soils. Again, high biomass diversity, beneficial organisms that secrete antibiotics that can happen naturally. Again, parasitism, and then limited availability of nutrients being supplied to the pathogens. Having large numbers of organisms, again, is going to create that competition. It's going to limit their food supply for those pathogens. How can plants survive without readily available nutrients? A lot of times you think about readily available nutrients in terms of those salts being solubilized and available. Nitrogen being in soluble form, available for a plant to intake. If those soluble forms of nutrients are available, how can our plant survive? Well, there's a symbiotic relationship between plants and microorganisms and healthy suppressive soils. So when we have solubilized nitrogen that the plant doesn't need in that place and time, microorganisms can actually immobilize those nutrients, hold on to them for the plant to use at a later date. An example of this is mycorrhiza fungi and other bacteria live on and near the roots and scavenge nutrients for the plants to use. So mycorrhiza fungi is pretty remarkable in the fact that it'll colonize the root zone and it will feed off of the gases, or at least in part off the gases that the roots of the plant are putting out. And in turn, the mycorrhiza fungi can reach out into the soils for the plant and bring food sources back to the plant, which means the plant isn't using energy to grow a larger root zone. Its energy is going to be focused on growing the things that we want typically, which are the fruits or the tissue of the plant. So mycorrhiza fungi is one of the most beneficial organisms that lives in soil. Now, mycorrhiza fungi is pretty predominant in healthy compost piles. We can also buy mycorrhiza fungi, typically in a dry form and apply it as needed. What it does, again, it creates a fungal mat around the root zone, and that creates a barrier. It also secretes chemicals that help suppress diseases. Goes back to that competition. Can help increase the nutrient and water uptake of the plant roots. And again, it changes the type of root exudance. So the root will start exuding gases that the mycorrhiza prefers, and the mycorrhiza will then help find food sources for the plant. And this is what it looks like on the left if you did a kind of a dissection of a root zone. You can see this white fuzz that colonizes that root zone. Again, it helps protect it and helps find its food source. And on the right side, it's an up close look at how the mycorrhiza physically interacts with the root zone. Then we have crop rotations. We talked a little bit about crop rotations in the integrated pest management lecture, so go there for a little bit more. But again, we want to eliminate this fact that we have this large target that's present year after year for long periods of time. And we can do that by somewhat disguising the crop, and we can do that by changing what we grow in those areas. The key there is rotating that crop with another crop that does not have the same susceptibility. This will not help us protect our crop from wind-blown pathogens or insects, particularly flying insects from outside areas. Some pathogens can exist without the host for long periods of time. An example of that would be fusarium wilt, common for basil. If we get fusarium wilt on basil and we're growing in the soil, that fusarium wilt can live within the soils for many years without basil or a susceptible host being present. So years later, we can go back in, plant basil, and it'll get affected by the fusarium wilt that was found many years before. Other disease management factors: the pH of the soil, calcium levels, nitrogen and the forms of nitrogen, and available nutrients as a whole. You see a couple examples below. Calcium helps control damping off. Damping off is a disease that you get right at the base of the plant as it comes out of the soil or media that you're growing in. And it's typically caused by too much moisture at that top layer. We see it a lot with herbs, primarily because when we plant herbs, unlike when we plant a head of lettuce, like in plugs, we plant one seed per plug. Herbs, you typically plant many seeds per plug, and then as they sprout, they're very compact in a confined place, and it restricts air movement, and that top layer of media tends to be wet, so that restricted air movement means it creates an environment for damping off to occur. And then if we lack calcium, calcium is critical to ensuring we have a strong cell wall. So lack of calcium means a weak cell wall, an environment for this disease to survive in, and it makes that kind of a perfect storm for damping off to be prevalent. Adding compost means adding organic matter, and if we're adding compost, we're supplying microorganisms, but we're also supplying the food source, hence the organic matter, to the soil for those microorganisms to survive for longer periods of time. Other methods of disease suppression, again, crop covering and rotation, mulching, manures. Some manures create antibiotics to help suppress different types of pathogens. Compost works because it has a diversity of microorganisms and high levels of microorganisms. It's organic matter, so it's a great food source for microorganisms. Can prevent spore germination because we heat up our compost piles in the metabolizing process. That germination from seed and spores from pathogens can be annihilated. Can help activate genes in the plant that helps make the plant more unsusceptible to diseases as well. Briefly talking about compost here, we have a dry compost which is less than 34% moisture, and that's usually high colonized high by funguses. Semi-dry compost, which is 40 to 50% moisture, usually colonized by both fungus and bacteria. And an open air compost, which kind of refers to higher levels of moisture. Higher pH in those piles can increase biocontrol agents, but the open air compost, the higher moisture, is the most diverse in terms of the fungus and bacterial counts. And again, the more diversity means the more suppression ability of that compost. In terms of maturity of compost, maturity usually comes within 4+ months, but it really depends on the method of compost you're using, because sometimes you can speed that process up by using things like air blowers and so forth, which will greatly increase the rate of decomposition within the compost pile. But we want to use mature compost. If you're a field grower, a lot of times you incorporate that compost several months before you're planting, because what happens in that period of time is not only does it give the ability for the microorganisms to colonize the soils, but then also begin to break down the organic matter and minerals in the soils and convert the organic matter and mineralization into solubilized salts that the plant can consume when you plant it after some time. Compost quality is dependent on the raw materials you're using. Again, if we're using a poor manure source, our end product will be somewhat poor as well. The maturity of the pile and the overall composting process. Are we ensuring that that pile is getting hot enough to where it can burn off certain pathogens and seeds from weeds and so forth? Higher quality compost contains suppressive organisms, high rates of mycorrhiza, and the seed from weeds should be killed in the composting process. All right, so in summary, the best way to help suppress diseases is, one, to ensure we're not creating an environment that is favorable for diseases. So let's look at the moisture content of our soils, and in our media, are we allowing it to dry out a bit before we reapply it, or is the media and soils just wet all the time? It's wet all the time. We're lacking oxygen in that environment, creates an environment for disease and pathogens to affect our host plants. The more competition of organisms in the soils and medias will help suppress diseases as well. Compost quality, the better the quality, the more effective it's going to be. And then think about, if you're a field grower, applying that compost a month in advance of applying or planting your crop to, again, allow the microorganisms to colonize the soils and as well to convert the organic matter and minerals into plant food by the time you actually get your crop in the ground. So that does it for a brief on suppressing diseases. We'll see you next time.